When you think end of a castle, you probably picture this: a heroic, desperate siege, the thunder of war machines, the clash of steel, a relentless army at the gates, and a few brave defenders holding out against impossible odds. We see these stone giants as the ultimate symbols of power, prestige, and strength. For centuries, they dominated the landscape of Europe and beyond, the physical embodiment of a lord's authority, designed to withstand anything the medieval world could throw at them. They were the apex predators of architecture, built of sweat, stone, and sheer force of will. But look around today. Travel through the countrysides of England, France, or Germany. Journey through the hills of Syria or the valleys of Wales. What do you often see? Ruins, skeletal remains, towers open to the sky, great halls carpeted with grass, and broken walls that whisper of a long-lost grandeur. While thousands of castles are still standing intact, it's the ruins that so often capture our imagination. And that presents a fundamental paradox. If these castles were so powerful, so unconquerable, why are so many of them destroyed? Why did these titans of stone fall? What if I told you that the epic siege, the glorious last stand we see in movies, is largely a myth? It's not how most castles met their end. The real story is far less about heroic battles and far more about something colder, more calculated, and in the end, far more effective. The truth is a story of deliberate, systematic destruction, often waged not by foreign enemies, but the castle's own countrymen. It's a story of vengeful kings, political revolutions, and one surprising invention that rendered these stone behemoths obsolete. The real culprits who destroyed so many of the world's castles weren't always soldiers storming the walls. They were politicians with decrees, engineers with crowbars, and a technological revolution that no wall, no matter how thick, could ever hope to withstand. This is the untold story of who and what really killed the castle.
To the main reason for the castle's demise, let's forget the chaos of the battlefield for a moment. Instead, picture a far more orderly scene. A team of men with ropes, levers, and tools methodically taking a fortress apart, stone by stone. This wasn't vandalism, it was policy. This was an act known as slighting. Slighting is the deliberate, strategic damaging of a fortification to render it militarily useless. The goal wasn't to level the entire structure. That would take way too much time and money. The goal was to cripple it, to break its back so that it could never again be used as a base of power. Think of it as a form of political surgery, cutting the source of potential rebellion out of the landscape. And in the late medieval and early modern periods, this practice became chillingly common. Archaeological evidence from slighted castles shows just how precise this was. It wasn't random destruction. The damage was carefully targeted. Engineers might undermine one corner of a keep, causing a catastrophic collapse of that section while leaving other parts standing. They might tear down the gatehouse, the castle's strongest point, or breach a specific section of the curtain wall. Sometimes they even left the domestic areas, like the Great Hall or the chapel, untouched, focusing purely on neutralizing the military capability. It was a clear message: you can live here, but you can no longer defy me from here. But who was ordering this and why? The answer reveals a fundamental shift in the nature of power. The first and most prolific culprit in the destruction of castles was the very authority they were often built to serve, the state itself.
Much of the Middle Ages, power was decentralized. A king might rule a realm, but powerful dukes and barons held immense authority in their own lands, an authority symbolized by their private castles. From within these stone walls, a rebellious lord could defy his king, control local trade, and project power that rivaled the crown's. The castle was the linchpin of this fragmented power structure. So, as ambitious monarchs sought to create centralized, modern nations, they identified the private castle as their number one domestic threat. To build a unified state, you first had to break the power of the regional lords, and to do that, you had to take away their castles. In England, this process was brutally effective under the Tudor dynasty. They systematically targeted the fortifications of powerful nobles to ensure no one but the crown could command a serious military force. In France, the policy was just as widespread. Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to King Louis XIII in the 17th century, famously orchestrated the destruction of many baronial castles. His aim was to eliminate the last vestiges of feudal opposition and cement the absolute authority of the French monarchy. It's said that Louis XIII destroyed more castles than he ever built, a stark testament to this era of internal consolidation. The ruins you see dotting the French and English countryside aren't just remnants of old wars, they're monuments to the birth of the modern nation-state. Each broken tower represents a victory for centralized government over regional warlords.
Internal consolidation was one motive for sliding. The aftermath of war was another. After a brutal civil war or a war of independence, the victorious side faced a serious problem, a landscape full of enemy strongholds. Occupying every single one was impossible, but leaving them intact was an open invitation for the defeated enemy to regroup and use them again. The logical and ruthless solution was to slight them. Perhaps the most famous proponent of this strategy was Robert the Bruce during the First War of Scottish Independence. As he captured castles held by the English, he systematically destroyed them. Castles like Roxburgh and Edinburgh, powerfully symbolic of the Scottish crown, were nonetheless torn down after being recaptured. Bruce's reasoning was brutally pragmatic. He knew he lacked the manpower to garrison these fortresses against a potential English return. By slighting them, he denied these strategic assets to his enemy. Of course, many of these symbolic castles, like Edinburgh, were eventually rebuilt, but the strategy showed just how effective slighting could be for long-term independence. Centuries later, the same logic was applied with devastating effect during the English Civil War in the 1640s. After years of bloody conflict, the victorious Parliament found itself in control of a country filled with royalist castles. To prevent these fortresses from ever again becoming nests of rebellion, Parliament embarked on a massive campaign of slighting. Over 100 castles and fortified houses were ordered to be slighted by Parliament. Iconic castles like Corfe Castle and Kenilworth Castle were deliberately ruined. At Kenilworth, the side of the Great Keep most visible to the surrounding countryside was pulled down, a clear public demonstration of Parliament's power. Not all were completely destroyed. At Berkeley Castle, for instance, a small but critical section of the outer wall was demolished, enough to neutralize it militarily, while leaving the rest of the structure intact. This again shows the calculated nature of the act.
Strategy of strategic destruction wasn't unique to Europe. Far away in the Levant, Muslim rulers fighting the Crusader states faced the exact same problem. The Crusaders were master castle builders, and the lands they controlled were dotted with formidable fortresses like Crac de Chevalier and Chastel Blanc. When the Mamluk Sultan Baybars rose to power in the mid-13th century, he launched a relentless campaign to permanently expel the Crusaders. He was a brilliant and ruthless commander who understood that capturing a Crusader castle was only half the battle. To ensure the Crusaders could never return, he needed to erase their presence. After capturing castles at Jaffa and the great city of Antioch, Baybars didn't just defeat the garrisons, he ordered the fortifications razed and the cities sacked. While he famously captured the mighty Crac de Chevalier in 1271 and preserved it for his own use, his general policy towards many other Crusader fortifications was one of obliteration. This policy helped ensure the Crusader dream of a permanent kingdom in the Holy Land was built on foundations that could be and were systematically dismantled. So when we ask who did it, the first and most significant answer points not to a faceless army, but to a calculated act of political and military will. Kings, parliaments, and sultans, in their quest to build nations and secure victory, became the greatest castle breakers in history. They understood a profound truth. The ultimate power isn't in having a castle, but in having the power to unmake one. Even if castles had survived the wrecking crews of vengeful kings, their fate was already sealed. A new sound was beginning to echo across the battlefields of the late Middle Ages, a deafening roar that would shatter not only stone walls, but the very foundations of medieval warfare. The second great culprit in the destruction of the castle wasn't a person at all. It was an invention: gunpowder. For centuries, castle design was an arms race. As attackers developed more powerful trebuchets, defenders built higher, thicker walls. By the 14th century, the stone concentric castle had become the apex of defensive architecture. A well-built, well-provisioned castle was almost impossible to take by force. Then came the cannon. Early firearms were unreliable and inaccurate, but by the 15th century, artillery had evolved into a truly devastating weapon. The development of larger cannons firing heavy iron cannonballs fundamentally changed the physics of a siege. A trebuchet lobbed its payload in a high arc, dispersing its energy. It could harass a garrison, but it struggled to bring down a massive curtain wall. A cannon, however, fired on a relatively flat trajectory. This allowed an attacker to concentrate immense kinetic energy on a single low point of a wall again and again. The cannonball acted like a massive hammer blow, pulverizing the masonry and ultimately shattering it. The high vertical walls that had been a castle's greatest strength suddenly became its greatest weakness, a perfect, unmissable target. The effect was revolutionary. Sieges that once took years could now be over in weeks. The legendary walls of Constantinople, which had repelled countless attacks for a millennium, finally fell to the massive cannons of Sultan Mehmed II in 1453. The shockwave from that event reverberated across Europe. Suddenly, lords and kings realized their ancestral strongholds weren't safe anymore. The age of the castle wasn't over overnight, but the writing was on the wall, written in gunpowder and smoke. Military architecture had to adapt or die, and it did by completely reversing its principles. If high walls were now a death sentence, the future must lie in low, thick ones. This gave birth to a new style of fortification known as the Trace Italienne, or the Star Fort. The Star Fort was the antithesis of medieval castle. Instead of soaring to the sky, it hunkered down, presenting a low profile to enemy cannons. Its walls were incredibly thick, often an earthen rampart faced with brick or stone, designed to absorb the impact of cannonballs. Most importantly, its star shape was a masterpiece of geometry. The pointed bastions were angled so that defenders could fire along the face of every adjacent wall, eliminating the dead zones at the base of the walls that had plagued medieval castles. These new artillery fortresses were astronomically expensive, but they were what the new age of warfare demanded. In many cases, old medieval walls were torn down and their stone repurposed to create their replacement. The castle was literally cannibalized to create its own replacement.
Technological shift was mirrored by a profound social one. As castles lost their military purpose, the nobility's reason for maintaining them evaporated. Security was no longer found behind a private wall, but under the protection of a king with a royal army and artillery. The aristocracy's focus shifted from military might to displaying wealth and culture. They stopped building grim, drafty fortresses and started commissioning magnificent, comfortable manor houses and palaces. This was the age of Hampton Court in England and the Château of the Loire Valley in France, designed with huge glass windows and ornamental gardens, features that would have been suicidal in a medieval castle. A lord's home was no longer a military base, it was a work of art. The castle, by contrast, became a relic, a cold, uncomfortable, and militarily useless symbol of a bygone era. For many noble families, the choice was easy. The castle was simply abandoned. And that brings us to our final culprits. They aren't as dramatic as a king's decree or a cannon's roar, but their effect was just as final. For the thousands of castles that weren't slighted or made obsolete by artillery, their end came through a slow, quiet process of decay, driven by economics and neglect. Here's the thing about castles. They were ruinously expensive. The cost to build one could bankrupt even the wealthiest lords. King Edward I's iron ring of castles in Wales, like Carnarvon and Conwy, is a prime example. The total cost of his Welsh building program is estimated to have been over £80,000, an almost unbelievable sum for the late 13th century, consuming the vast majority of the crown's annual revenue. But building the thing was just the start. The real financial drain was the upkeep. Roofs needed constant repair, walls needed repointing, and moats needed dredging. A castle required a permanent garrison and a household staff. It wasn't just a building, it was a living, breathing, and incredibly hungry institution. As long as a castle served a vital purpose, these costs were justifiable. But once that purpose was gone, a lord or king, looking at their balance sheet, would see a massive expense with no practical return. So, for thousands of castles, the result was simple abandonment. The garrison was dismissed, the gates were barred, and the castle was left to the mercy of the elements. Without constant upkeep, nature quickly took over, and gravity and time did what no army could. For an abandoned castle, this natural decay was often sped up by human intervention. To the local population living in the shadow of a decaying fortress, that ruin wasn't history, it was a resource. It was a giant, pre-cut and conveniently located stone quarry. Throughout the post-medieval centuries, countless castles were systematically plundered for their building materials. Why quarry new stone when you could just pry dressed blocks from the castle wall? These stones were carted away to build local houses, farm walls, and churches. Lead from the roofs was melted down, and valuable iron was salvaged. This explains why so many castle ruins look like hollowed-out shells, stripped of their finer materials, leaving only the rubble core behind. In some cases, the plundering was so complete that entire castles vanished from the landscape. Not every abandoned castle met this fate. Some were too large or too remote to be fully quarried, surviving as the dramatic ruins we see today. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, their status underwent a final strange transformation. During the Romantic movement, these decaying ruins were suddenly seen in a new light. They weren't embarrassing relics, they were sublime, melancholic objects that spoke of the tragic grandeur of the past. Wealthy landowners began to treasure them, sometimes even building fake ruins or follies in their gardens. The rise of tourism turned places like Hampton Court and Tintern Abbey and Goodrich Castle into popular destinations. This newfound appreciation is, ironically, what saved them from being completely obliterated. They had ceased to be fortresses and had become...
When we stand before a ruined castle and ask, who did it? The answer is far more complex and fascinating than the myth of the heroic siege. The destruction of the medieval castle wasn't a single event, but a long process, a death by 1,000 cuts from a host of different culprits. Who destroyed the castles? It was the kings and architects of the modern state, like the Tudors in England and Cardinal Richelieu in France, who saw private fortresses as a threat and ordered them deliberately dismantled in acts of political demolition known as slighting. It was victorious commanders, from Robert the Bruce in Scotland to Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarians, who slighted captured strongholds to ensure they could never be used against them again. It was Sultan Baybars who methodically erased Crusader fortifications to permanently extinguish the dream of a Christian kingdom in the East. And then it was the inexorable march of technology. It was the engineers who perfected the cannon, turning the castle's high walls into a fatal vulnerability. The roar of artillery signaled the end of an era. Finally, it was the quieter but no less potent forces of economics and neglect. It was the crippling cost of maintenance that forced owners to simply walk away. And it was the local quarrymen who saw not a monument, but free building material, carrying the castles away piece by piece. The romantic image of the epic siege endures because it's a powerful story, but the truth is more revealing. The ruined castle isn't just a symbol of a forgotten age, it's a monument to the seismic shifts that created our modern world, the birth of the centralized nation-state, the disruptive power of technology, and the relentless pressure of economics and time. The empty shells of these great fortresses are not failures of defense, they are the tombstones of a world that had to pass away for our own to be born. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden history, please subscribe and click the bell for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments which historical myth you'd like us to investigate next. For those who want to explore this topic further, we've included a list of sources and recommended reading in the description below. Thanks for watching.